Hello class. So today I'm going to talk about emotions. Later in this presentation, we are going to talk about positive affect and how it's help broaden your cognition and make you think more creatively. So positive affect might have an effect on your learning. So feel free to watch this short funny clips to put yourself in a good mood and prepare yourself for learning this module. Once you finish watching, come back to this video. So this is our learning outcome number 1. Please take a few seconds to read it. So before we delve into emotions, we like to know, why did we develop emotions? So you may see that, you might see emotions is everywhere in our life, right? We see emotions in everyday life. We feel it multiple times per day. Why do we have it? And think of emotions. You can think of emotions like an alert system to the environment. So emotions help us to be alerted to our environment, to different situations and events that happen, and then it helps guide our responses to those situations. For example, it helps us recognize danger and threat of the environment. Fear is a very strong emotion and it's very palpable, and it sort of urges us to act in a certain way, for example, running from danger. But feelings and emotions can also alert us to opportunity, to good things in the environment, such as food, mating opportunities, social bonding, finding people who will like support and help us and guide us toward acquiring these resources in the environment. So in general, emotion is a highly evolved and very adaptive system that allows us to respond to the environment in an appropriate way. And ultimately, it helps us to survive better and reproduce successfully. So a lot of times we might find our emotions to be sort of a nuisance. You might feel anxiety when you don't want to feel it, or you might want to get rid of certain emotions. However, in the long span of thing, in sort of like an evolutionary view, emotions are very adaptive and useful most of the time. So before talking about emotions, let's talk about affect. Depends on the psychologist. A lot of researchers and psychologists, sometimes they use the term affect to refer to general mood states or emotions. For example, you might see when people say positive affect or negative affect, it's in an article, a lot of time it would refer to positive emotions collectively or negative emotions or negative mood collectively. However, I want to talk about a very specific construct, which is core affect. And this construct is important in modern emotion theory. So core affect reflects your bodily sensations, also called interoceptive sensations. What does it mean? In layman term, it just means your feelings that you can feel in your body. So if you pay close attention, when you have a feelings, when you have an emotions, and if you inspect, you actually have a very specific feelings in your body. For example, when you feel anxious, or kind of like feeling anxious in front of someone you're attracted to, or you feel in love, you might feel like butterflies in your stomach. So those feelings are core affect. Those are your bodily sensation. And core affect has two components or two characteristics or dimensions, right? The first one is valence. Core affect can feel positive or pleasant versus negative or unpleasant. The second component or dimensions is arousal. So core affect can have this characteristic of low arousal, low activations, or high arousal, high activation. So when you feel high arousal or highly activated, your pupil would dilate, palm sweating, heartbeat like faster and harder, and you feel like you're ready for actions. Versus when you feel low arousal, you might feel like resting and kind of like calming, and not wanting to move as much. So core affect is the combinations of valence and arousal. And you can think of these two dimensions as being orthogonal to each other. So you can feel, different combinations of unpleasant to pleasant with activated and deactivated. For example, let's say you feel the emotion excitement. So what is the characteristic of the core affect of excitement? It is the core affect for excitement would be pleasant and high arousal, right? So you feel good and you feel like your body is ready to spring into actions. How about contentment? Contentment would has a core affect that is pleasant but low arousal. So you feel kind of calm. You're good where you are. You don't need to do anything. Think about anger. Right? Anger would has a core affect of unpleasant and highly activated. And how about sadness? Sadness would have, or depressed. Feeling depressed would has a core affect of low activation, low arousal. So the person don't want to movement. They don't, they kind of like in a more resting state, immobilized state, and they feel unpleasant. So emotions is different from core affect, right? So emotion is a multi-component, momentary experience in response to a specific context or situations. So let's talk about this different, part of the definition. So an emotion is multi-component, right? So it does consist of core affect. So it does consist of a component of bodily feelings and sensations. However, an emotions also is attached to cognition. It's attached to how we interpret the situations. For example, if somebody says something that make you angry, so that anger response accompany is coupled with an interpretation that the environment is threatening you or the person is offending you. So cognitions, there's certain cognitive component and interpretations of the situations and of the emotion itself attached to the emotional experience. So the third component of the emotional experience is how people might have certain behavioral urges, and have certain behavior. For example, they might show some facial expression or move their face in a way. Maybe they like grind their teeth or something, and they might feel urges to sort of approach the other person for confrontational. So emotions are more than core affect. It's multi-component. And it's momentary because it only lasts for a few seconds to a few minutes, actually. And that might sound strange because a lot of time, sometimes you would feel bad all day, right? Yes, and that would be your mood and not an emotion. An emotion have a very short time frame and it goes away afterward. But moods is typically what's left after an emotion is felt. So mood is more long lasting, it's more diffuse, it doesn't feel as intense as an emotions. And a lot of time we might feel a mood without, you know, without it being a response to any specific situation. We just kind of like feel bad or feel good for most of the day without like thinking about why. So to distinguish between emotion and mood and core affect, you know, you might be confused, but you can think about core affect as an ingredient or a component of emotions. So you can think of emotions and moods to core affect is like different kind of cakes to flour. This is learning outcome number 2. I'll give you guys a couple seconds to read it. So all of the theories about emotions trying to explore the questions, what is the nature of emotions? And the basic emotions theory is going to be the first theory that we're talking about. This theory is pioneered by Paul Ekman and at Stanford University. And so according to the basic emotion theory, Ekman suggests that we have some core emotions which are innate. So he thinks there are about 6 or 7 evolutionarily given fundamental emotions. So why does he think that these emotions are basic and fundamental? It is because emotions are so ubiquitous around us. So this led to the view that maybe there are some fundamental emotions that were so critical to our survival that they were evolutionarily hardwired into our brain and body. Right? So the second component of this theory is these emotions, they're dedicated circuitry in our brain that is dedicated for these fundamental emotions. It's like a little switch in our brain. So for example, like when you feel anger, there are some switches in your brain that make you feel anger, right? And this basic emotion theory ideas is reflected in Inside Out. If you've seen the movie, there are 5 emotions within the little girl in the movie Inside Out, which is anger, sadness, jealousy, happy, and fear. And so according to Paul Ekman, the 6 basic emotions are anger, fear, disgust, surprise, happy or joy, and sadness. Right. So according to this theory, each of the basic emotions would correspond to a specific facial expression with a one-to-one correspondence, which means that if we feel anger, we will have this certain facial expression. If we feel happy, we will smile. If we feel sad, we would frown a little bit. If we feel disgust, we might like kind of wrinkle our nose, have a specific expression for disgust. And an emotional experience would trigger that specific expression on our face. So in other words, we encode this expression on our face when we have an emotional experience. So we broadcasting our emotional inner life to the world. And so other people can also, according to the basic emotion theory, decode this facial expression. So when we look at other people's facial expression, we can understand what emotions they're feeling. And these automatic transmissions of our emotional state to our facial expression, to the other, to the understanding of the observers who see our facial expressions, is believed to be adaptive in our evolutionary path. So, in other words, according to this theory, it is important that other people are able to understand our emotions. And it was good for the survival of the individual and of the group that people can read other people's emotions on their face. So why don't you try to label these photos with the 6 type of emotions. See if you can do it correctly. So this idea of basic emotion sounds very, very compelling, right? So you have these separate, fundamental, evolutionarily evolved, discrete emotions that have dedicated, circuitry, dedicated switch in our brain that serve a certain functions, that have specific expression, facial expression that is attached to them, and is universal, is recognizable by people all over the world. And so you would read a lot about the evidence for this theory in the textbook. However, according to more recent research, more modern theories on on emotions, the basic emotion theories might not be true. So according to Russell, in 1994, he wrote a paper basically reviewing the evidence for basic emotions, and he found that there's only minimal universality exists in emotion perception. That means these 6 categories of basic emotions are not necessarily recognized worldwide. There's a lot of inaccuracy when you bring these facial expressions to another culture, especially the culture that have little connection to the Western culture, and ask people to identify these emotional phase, and they're a lot less accurate. And he also made the point that emotions can occur without facial expression, and facial expressions can also occur without emotions. So you can probably easily think of the example in your life where you experience like happiness or joy or sadness, but you do not express it to other people, right? So it's not like a one-to-one mapping. When you feel sad, then you look sad, or when you feel happy, then you look happy. It doesn't always work that way. Also, you can think of the opposite situation when you have a certain facial expression that might broadcast a certain emotions, but you actually don't feel that emotion. Just think about the time when you're smiling at someone, when you see them, but actually you didn't necessarily feel happy or feel joy. So the most consistent finding about universality that people across different cultures can tell if someone is feeling good or bad. So people across culture can consistently tell the valence of your feelings. So if there's the 6 expression, they're only consistently able to tell whether someone is feeling good or feeling bad, but they're not able to tell with higher accuracy about whether someone feel a specific emotion like anger or sadness or jealousy. And again, for the experiences of emotions, the only universal experience that people share is that they can experience negative affect or positive affect, or in other words, whether they can experience goodness versus badness, pleasantness versus unpleasantness. For like more specific emotions, the experiences of people across culture vary. There's some emotions that in some culture they don't actually have it. This leads us to the second sort of group of theories about emotions, and you can refer to this group of theories about emotion as constructive constructionist approach to emotions, or approach to understanding emotion from a process point of view. So you can call it process theory of emotions. And so what this approach say is that emotions are not special mental states, right? So it's not unique in form, it's not unique in function, and it's not a cause from other mental states such as cognition and perceptions. Sorry, I misspoke. So basically it say that emotion is not a specific mental state. It's not unique from other form of mental states such as cognition and perception. It's actually composed from the same ingredients as cognition and perceptions. This approach also states that emotions are not caused by dedicated mechanism, right? So it's from the same mechanism that give you cognition. It's from the same mechanism that give you perception. And so instead, all mental states are seen as emerging from an ongoing, continually modified constructive process that involves more basic ingredients that are not specific to emotions. So basically what it say is emotions are constructed from more basic ingredients of cognition and perception and mental processes. So there's no like dedicated part of the brain that do emotions. There's no dedicated circuitry in the brain that just for emotion alone. Emotion is actually constructed from all the basic processes in the brain that are also involved in other mental processes. So the first theory in this approach, this is kind of like an older theory, which is called two-factor theory of emotions. It's from Schachter and Singer in the 1960s. So this is a this is a pre-modern take on the constructionist theory of emotions. And basically this theory say, what this theory said is that to experience an emotions, there is two steps. The first step is you would respond to an event or situations, right? So something happened to you would trigger a physiological response in your body. For example, maybe you see a spider and you start to feel like your heart beat faster and harder, and your palm just kind of starts getting sweaty. And then the second step of it is you would sort of assess your body sensations, your physiological change, and then you interpret that in the context of seeing a spider. And when you interpret your bodily change, you would think that, well, I see a spider, and then suddenly my hand got sweaty, my heart beat faster, I kind of feel a certain sensation in my body. I must be feeling fear. So of course you don't necessarily do this all consciously. This process can happen unconsciously. But through making sense of your bodily sensations in the context that create that physiological change in your body, you experience a specific emotions of fear. Right? So again, to review, the two-factor theory of emotion say that first, when you experience an emotion, there's a physiological arousal or physiological change in your body, and then you go through a cognitive interpretation of that physiological arousal, and which allow you to label your experience as, experiencing fear or experiencing happiness. So let's talk about a seminal research study conducted by Schachter and Singer to support their two-factor theories of emotions. So you might have seen this in your textbook. So in this study, the researcher had participants coming into the lab, and they give the participant a cover story that they wanted to test a new drug called Ciprocin. But this drug is actually epinephrine. Right? So the participants is going to be injected with epinephrine. And for those that don't know, epinephrine is a form of adrenaline. So it makes the body activate and aroused. So, and then this is our first IV. The participants was told, was giving the correct information or misinformation about the effect of the drug. So for the informed group, the participants were told that the drug was gonna make their heart pounding, their face blush and warm, their hands shaking. And in the misinformed group, participants were told of some false symptoms or some false effect of the drug. For example, they were told that their feet will feel numb, their body itching. So they were given the incorrect information about what they would feel after getting injected. And then afterward, they get injected with the drugs. Then they come into a room, and in the room there's another confederate. And so the confederate is the second independent variable, how the confederate act. So both the participants and the confederate filled out some questionnaires, and the questionnaires, there's some questions that are pretty ridiculous. For example, one of the questions asked, with how many men other than your father has your mother had extramarital relationship with? 4 and under, 5 to 9, 10 and over. So the questions are pretty ridiculous. And so the confederate acted in response in two different ways for two different levels of the independent variable. So for one group of participants, the confederate would act sort of euphoric, quote unquote euphoric in the language of Schachter and Singer. For example, they would fold paper airplanes, sort of like laugh at the questions, playing spitball, etc. in the lab. And in another condition, the confederate would act angry at the questions, and they would storm out with their book, saying that, well, I don't have to tell them that. I don't have to answer this ridiculous question. Then afterward, participants were taken into a different room, and then there they would report their emotions on a scale. So what is the result? For the participants that were misinformed about the effect of the drug, and remember, they're taking a drug that gives them high arousal, right? So these participants in the misinformed condition, they would feel more euphoric when the confederate acted euphoric, and they would feel more. They would report it feeling more anger when the confederate acted angry. But this is actually not the case for the informed condition. The emotions of the participants were not affected in when they were informed about the actual effect of the drug, so their emotion was not affected by how the Confederate act. So what does this all mean? In the informed condition, participants know why they're feeling, why their heart pounding, why their hands is shaking, why their face flush. Right? They had an explanation for their high arousal physiology. In the misinformed conditions, they also experience a change in their physiology. They feel activated and aroused, but they don't know why. So their cognition basically search for an interpretation of their body sensations, and because there's no readily available explanation, they use the information from their context. They use the information from how the Confederate act. When the Confederate act euphoric, the participant feel the high arousing sensation in the body, probably would see their reaction as being silly and euphoric as well. Whereas when the Confederate act angry, the participant, when they feel that their hand is trembling, their heart pounding, they interpret that as, well, the other person is angry. I probably also feeling angry because I have all these body sensation that indicate that I'm being angry. So this research is consistent with the idea that, first you have physiological arousal in your emotional process, and then the cognitive interpretations help to shape your emotional experience, help to shape how you view your emotional experience as, being angry or being euphoric. So the theory of constructed emotion is sort of like a modern expansion on the two-factor theories of emotions. And an important researcher that championed this theory is Dr. Kristin Lindquist, and she's a faculty at UNC social psychologist, right? She's a faculty at UNC, and I would like you guys to click on the book for a video of Dr. Lindquist explaining the theory of constructed emotions. And there's also a recent book coming out by Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is Dr. Lindquist's mentor, and she's the one who pioneered the theory of constructed emotion. So what does the theory of constructed emotion say? It says that emotion is constructed from more basic psychological ingredients. So similar to Schechter and Singer, two-factor theory. They said the emotion is from physiological change and from the interpretation, from cognitive interpretations of the change. Similarly, theories of constructed emotion say that the one ingredient of an emotion is the basic feelings of pleasure or displeasure and arousal from a person's body change, which is the core affect. This core affect then is made meaningful as an emotion when a person make an attribution about the meaning of their own body changes or about someone else facial muscles movement. So when they see another person's face, have a certain shape, has the muscles of shape like smiling or like frowning, they would interpret that based on the situation to infer how the other person is feeling. So that is similar to the two-factor model theory of emotion so far by Schechter Singer. The new contributions of the theory of constructed emotions is that when we interpret the core affect using external context, using the context, we also depends on our conceptual knowledge about emotions, about emotional categories. So you can think of the conceptual knowledge about emotional categories or emotions as schemas for emotional categories. And emotional categories here mean categories such as sadness, anger, happy, jealousy, etc. So basically, we interpret core affect based on external context using our existing schemas of each emotional categories. And those together sort of give rise to our emotional experience. So where is the conceptual knowledge about emotions come from? Well, it comes from our language. For example, the emotional word in English, angry, sad, disgust. And there's some emotion words that exist only in one language but not another, and that shape your emotional experience. There's also cultural variations in how each emotion is experienced in different cultures, so that also affect how you experience your emotion and how you perceive the emotions of other people. And finally, you can also get conceptual knowledge about emotion through your life experience. So to just a quick review, emotions, according to the constructed theory of emotions, are products of more basic psychological ingredients. It's not like a special thing in itself. And so we perceive emotions on other people's faces when we make attributions, or in other words, when we interpret their positive or negative facial muscle movements using context and using conceptual knowledge about emotion categories or types. And we experience emotions in our own body when we make attributions about our positive or negative feelings using context again and using our conceptual knowledge about emotion categories or types. So when you look at this, you would think, well, but the discrete emotions, theory, or the basic emotion theory is still pretty compelling. I'm pretty sure, I can tell if somebody's happy when they have a certain expressions, or when they're sad, they would have a certain expression. So what is the evidence for the, constructionist approach to understanding emotion? So I'm going to present to you guys some evidence that is consistent with the constructed theories of emotion. So look at this guy's face. What do you think this guy is feeling? All right. So now if the emotions were readily perceived on faces and didn't require any additional interpretation or attributions to context, based on context and based on emotional knowledge, then you would be easily able to make meaning of this facial expression without any context whatsoever. So does this person feel angry, fearful, disgusted, or happy? What do you guys think? I'm gonna give you guys 2 seconds to guess, and then I'll show. Okay, now what do you think? What is his feeling? He probably feeling great and euphoric, maybe. So here we're using the context to make the appraisal of the meaning of his facial expression. Without this context, the facial expression itself is ambiguous. You can maybe tell that it's positive or negative, but even that was really hard in this context. So is it all about the face of the person that can broadcast their emotional feelings, or are there other things that matter? Okay, so here's an example. Without seeing these people's bodies, what would you say they're feeling? It's pretty hard, right? It seems like they're in pain. Now, what do you think? What is the person in the image number 1 feeling, and number 4, right? Or number 2 and number 3. So if you notice, number 1 and number 3 actually has the same facial expression as is number 2 and number 4. And so these tennis player, the researchers just kind of crop their face out and then put their face into a different body. Right? So even though this tennis player has the same facial expression, when you put them in 2 different body type, the number 1 tennis player and number 4 looks like they're losing, and so it seems like they're experiencing frustration and disappointment, whereas in picture number 2 and number 3, it looks like they're winning. So they look like they're experiencing joy and euphoria. So the body totally changes the attribution you make about the meaning of the face. So context is really, really vital in interpreting an emotional expression. And and as we've explored before in the Schachter-Singer experiment with the epinephrine, context is also extremely important for how you would interpret your own emotional experience. So the constructed theory of emotions also say that language and emotional knowledge is really important for the experience of emotions. What is the evidence for that? So I'm going to tell you guys about an experiment, a study that will show the evidence for that. The actual setup of the study is is more complicated, but this is the basic idea. Right? So how do we figure out if an emotional concept is important? Using experiment, how would you do that? Right? So first you might try to switch on and switch off an emotional concept and see if it matters for emotional perceptions or experience, right? So how do you switch on and switch off an emotional concept? The researchers here use a pretty clever method, right? So for the independent variable, they would manipulate the semantic accessibility of an emotional concept, of an emotion concept. So to make the emotion concept more accessible, for example, let's say we want to make anger more accessible to people. We would ask people to say anger 3 times, and this is called priming. We've discussed it in the previous module. So by saying, the participants were divided into 2 groups. One group say anger 3 times, and that make anger become more accessible. The other group say anger 30 times, and this technique is called satiation. So after we say a word a bunch of time, like many, many, many times, the word temporarily loses meanings to us. So by satiating people to the concept of anger, by asking them to say it 30 times, the researcher temporarily turned off the concept of anger for these participants. Okay, so again, participant group into 2 groups, one prime with anger, and one their anger concept got turned off. Then the researcher show these participants 2 pictures, like a set of pictures that is in pair. So for example, they would show participant 2 pictures with people showing a similar expressions of emotions, for example, anger. And some of the pictures also show two people, but each of them experience a different kind of emotion. And then they asked participants to judge whether these two people feel the same emotions or these two people feel, a different kind of emotion from one another. So if you think that emotion concept is not important for emotion perception, we would expect that the participants who were primed with anger versus the participants who were switched off from the concept of anger would be equally fast as determining whether the pictures of emotional expression match or mismatch from one another, right? So the researcher would measure the times it takes for participants to judge whether these two facial expressions are the same or different. And so what they find is that in the group of participants that was satiated with the concept of anger, which means they kind of like temporarily forget the meaning of anger, it takes them longer to classify this photo of emotions. So what does this mean? It means that when they don't have access to the concept of anger, it takes them longer to sort of perceive the emotion of anger. So which means that language play an important role in sort of allow people to perceive certain kind of emotion. All right, so this is one of your essay options. If you choose to complete this essay options, please respond to all of these prompts. Prompt number 1, describe in your own words the basic elements that combine to give rise to an emotion experience according to the theory of constructed emotion. Prompt number 2, discuss how the theory of constructed emotions might lead to different therapeutic approaches for patients with emotion disorders than would Paul Ekman's basic emotion theory. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to reread the prompt if you want. Feel free to pause the video. So this is learning outcome number 3. I'll give you a few seconds to read it. So according to theorists who support the theory of constructed emotions, like Kristen Lindquist or Lisa Feldman Barrett, physiological arousal or core affect is just one of the ingredients that create your emotional experience. Right? It requires a sort of a cognitive interpretations component to make sense of that, of the physiological arousal. So there's possibility that these physiological arousal might be misinterpreted or misattributed to a different cause. And Dutton and Aaron in 1970s conducted an experiment that sort of illustrate this phenomenon of misattribution of arousal. So what they did is they recruited a group of male undergraduate students, and then they assigned them to 2 different conditions. In one condition, the group would walk through a low, steady bridge, and in another condition, the group would walk through a hanging bridge, which is kind of precarious. And what this manipulation does is it manipulates physiological arousal. Right? So when you walk on a hanging bridge and it's shaky, people is more likely to be a little bit more anxious, be a little bit more physiologically aroused than a steady bridge. And then they would the students would be interacting with what the authors, what the researcher describe in their paper as an attractive research assistant of the opposite sex, an attractive female research assistant. And so this research assistant, after the study is over, would ask the participant, would give the participants her number and ask them to call her later if they want to know the result of the study. And for the dependent variable, the researcher measure whether the participants would call her after the experiment is over, and the assumption is that if the participant mistook the arousal caused by walking on a hanging bridge as attraction to the research assistant, then they would call her more in the hanging bridge condition compared to the stone bridge or the steady bridge condition. And that is exactly what they find. So in the stone bridge condition, there are a low number of students that would call the research assistant, whereas in the hanging bridge condition, there are more male participants that call the research assistant. So again, the interpretation of the result is that the participant in the hanging bridge condition mistook their physiological arousal due to the anxiety of walking on the bridge as the feeling of attractions to the research assistant, and so then they would try to call her with the implicit assumptions of trying to make social connection with her, right? Because the feeling of anxiety of walking on a hanging bridge might feel the same as the feeling of being attracted to somebody. So in another study, a year later, Cantor, Zillman, and Bryan sort of show another way to demonstrate this phenomenon of arousal misattributions. So in their study, all of the participants went through sort of like the same activity that raised their physiological arousal. So they all sort of run on treadmill for a minute. The difference is in one group of participants, they take 1 minute of rest before moving on to the next part of the experiment. The second group would take 5-minute rest, and the third group would take 9-minute rest. So after, and the assumption is that the 1 minute group rest, the group that take 1 minute rest would have the highest amount of activations. The 5-minute group has a medium amount of physiological arousal, and then the 9-minute group would have the least amount of physiological arousal. So the next part of the experiment is really interesting. The participants were asked to watch a video clip from a movie, and this is actually the movie that they used in the experiment. It's called Naked Under Leather. And the title tells you a lot, but there's a lot more to see. So basically, it's kind of like a B-rated softcore porn. And I assume that the participants in the experiment were also male undergraduate students. And so after this 3 group of students watched the movie, they were asked to rate how enjoyable they find the movie. So the result is the 1 minute resting group and the 9-minute resting group was not different from one another. All right. However, the 5-minute resting group, after running on the treadmill, rated the movie as being more enjoyable compared to the 1 minute or the 9-minute resting group. So the group in the middle said they enjoy the movie the most. What does this mean? Right? What That's kind of odd. What is the researcher interpretations of this result? Basically, the interpretation is that for the 1 minute resting group, these participants are still, highly physiologically aroused, like activated. However, they can, because they just completed the running exercise, they can attribute their physiological arousal to running on the treadmill. For the 9-minute group, right, they have rested for a long time, and at that point they're no longer physiologically aroused or activated. Therefore, they also don't enjoy the movie as much as the 5-minute resting group. So this group is kind of like the sweet spot. After resting for 5 minutes, their physiology is still activated. Their heart is still pounding. However, they rested for long enough that they no longer attribute their arousal to running on the treadmill. Right? So when they watch the soft porno, they misattribute their physiological arousal to being aroused by the movie. And therefore they rated the movie as being the most enjoyable among the three groups. So a quick recap, the 1-minute group, they didn't misattribute their arousal to watching the porno because they only rest for 1 minute, and so they still remember that they were aroused because they were running like 1 minute before. The 9-minute group was more well rested, so they're no longer physically aroused, and therefore they also didn't enjoy the movie as much as the group that rests for 5 minutes. They rest for 5 minutes. They still physiologically aroused, but they didn't attribute that arousal to running on the treadmill, but they attribute that to watching the porno. Therefore, they rated that they enjoy the movie the most. Okay, so I would like you guys to just jot down everything you remember about the previous two study, the Dutton and Aaron study, and Canton, Zimmerman, and Bryan study. Jot down the method and the results, because this study might be a little complicated, so it's a good retrieval practice. All right, so this is our learning outcome number 4. Let's talk about affect as information theory. So this research is pioneered by Short and Clore in the 1980s. And the gist of this theory is that we use our affect, our feelings, as evidence in our judgment, as a piece of information for making judgment and decision. So when we feel positive affect, this is used as evidence to signal to ourselves that everything is okay, so we can keep doing what we're doing, or we can, sort of like explore our surroundings without worrying about anything. And when we feel negative affect, this feeling would signal to us that something is wrong, right? So something needs to be changed. Maybe we need to slow down, or we need to speed up, or we need to pay clearer attention to our environment. And so affect in general, it impacts how we pay attention to and scrutinize our environment and our own decisions and judgment. And the reason that these affect and feeling has this effect is because they evolve a system to help alert us to what's happening in the environment. It's kind of like our radar, right? So when we feel negative affect, it often means that there's something threatening in the environment, and so it make us, it change our view of the environment. It changed our attention to the environment in a way that help us to spot those issues and making a judgment, making a change to adapt to those environment. So to support the theory, Schwartz and Clore conducted a seminal research study on how affect would affect people life satisfaction in general. So this is based on the knowledge that the weather affect one's mood, right? So on sunny day, people feel happier. They have better mood. On rainy day, people feel a little lower. They have worse mood. So the researchers want to see whether this, temporary mood would affect people's judgments of their life, how satisfied they are with their life overall, just based on how they feel currently, right? So they call people either on sunny day versus rainy days to ask about how satisfied they are with their life overall. And so that's the first IV, which is the weather, sunny day versus rainy day. The second IV is whether they would mention to these people about the weather. So in one of the conditions, they simply ask people how satisfied they are with their life. In another condition, they ask people, oh, how's the weather there? So they indirectly mention the weather to the participants. And in the third condition, they would directly mention that, well, you know that weather affect your mood, right? So they kind of like tell people about the research about how weather affect their mood. So what is the findings? Basically, the researcher found that when they did not mention the weather condition to people and simply asked people to assess their satisfaction with their entire life, they find that the people who were asked on sunny day reported higher satisfactions with their life, and the people who were asked on rainy day report lower satisfactions. However, once the researcher mentioned the weather, either indirectly or directly, about how weather affect your mood, the differences disappear. Why do you think the effect went away in the mentioned condition when they mentioned the weather? So the reason is that people use their mood as a piece of evidence or information in judging their life satisfactions, besides all other factors such as success, financial security, relationship, etc. So when the researcher make people aware of their mood, participants might have reduced the weight of their mood or their feelings as a piece of evidence in judging their life satisfaction. So therefore now they judge their life satisfactions the same whether their mood is low or high. But when the weather was not mentioning, people might have used their mood as an important piece of evidence about how they, how satisfied they are with their life. Another study also support this idea. So in this study, they have people making evaluations of other people. Right? So they have participants come into the lab, and they would play the role of hiring, hiring managers, and they would evaluate people's applications and candidacy. And in one of the conditions, the participants were given Pepsi and peanut. And in another condition, they weren't given anything to snack on. And so the assumption is that people who are given Pepsi and peanuts going to feel better, right? Because they have something to snack on. And therefore, that would impact their evaluation and judgments of the candidates. And so that turned out to be true. So the people who got Pepsi and peanut, they felt better, and therefore they have more positive evaluations of the job application profile. And we find that affect even affect how people perceive the environment visually, so it affects our awareness. In this study by Marks and Matthews, they manipulated people's positive feelings or negative feelings through pictures. And so they show some pictures, some pleasant pictures, some unpleasant pictures to people. And then afterward, they show people different pictures of the environment. And what they find is that when people are induced to feel positive emotions, positive feelings, their visual field widen, right? So they see more in the environment. However, they also have less attention to details. So they have a wider visual field, but they pay less attention to details. And people who were induced to feel negative, they have a narrower visual field. So it's akin to getting tunnel vision, right? However, they also view the environment with more scrutiny. So they pay a lot more attention to smaller details in the environment, although they see, like a narrower visual field. And the researchers, the psychologists, explain or hypothesize that this is due to, this is evolutionarily adaptive. It is because when we feel negative, it means that there might be something threatening in the environment. So people, so there's a sense of threat. So people feel that there's a need to scrutinize and pay more attention to detail to detect the threat. Whereas when people feel positive, they would broaden their attentions to spot opportunities in the environment, because when we feel positive, it means that things around us are safe. So from research of Mark and Matthews, it provides a great segue to the theories about positive affect by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson. She is a UNC social psychologist, and she is my current research advisor. And so she put forward the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. Right? So she said that the experience, the momentary experience of positive emotions would produce a range of effect. And to remind you, this experience is momentary. They're very short-lived. If you think about emotions, they only last a few seconds to a few minutes. But what she's saying is, this moment of positive emotions is already enough to cause some pretty interesting effect on our, perceptions, cognitions, and over time it would be accumulated to produce larger effect on our body. So in the moment, the experience of positive emotion would broaden our mental activities, and in the long term, it would build resources. So when we feel positive emotions, what does it build in the moment? What does it broaden in the moment? Right. So it's broaden our awareness, and it's shown in the Martin Matthews study is that when people feel positive, they have a wider visual field. And it's also broaden your thoughts and action tendencies, which mean that you have more exploratory thoughts, you have more exploratory actions, right? So let's contrast this with negative emotions. When ones feel negative emotions, they typically have a very specific action urges. For example, when someone feels fear, well, what do? Either fight or flight, right? Or freeze. When someone feels contentment or joy, there's not really a specific thoughts and actions that is associated with it. Maybe someone might jump for joy, or they might, reach out to other people to share good news, or they might do whatever. There's not a specific actions that is tied to the positive emotions or positive affect that you feel. But when there's negative emotions, the actions tendency is very specific. So that's why positive affect and positive emotions would, induce more exploratory thoughts and actions, more diverse thoughts and action patterns. Also, because it's broadened and expand our cognitions, it helps us to become more creative. So this has been empirically, demonstrated that when people receive an inductions of positive feelings, they become more creative problem solver because they can think more broadly and their cognition is expanded. When we feel positive emotions, we are also more likely to identify opportunities in the environment, especially opportunities for social connections. People become more pro-social when they feel positive. They tips more, they socialize with other people more. And finally, positive emotions experience would propel us to approach a potential reward. So, to secure potential resources in the environment. So these are the momentary effect, right? But in the long term, the accumulations of moments and moments of positive emotions and positive affect would help us build more durable resources, right? Long-lasting resources, such as psychological resources. So accumulations of moments of positive emotions over time help people become happier and become more resilient. Right? So resilience means that you can experience stress and pressure and dramatic events and still being able to bounce back to where you were, or even grow after like hardship. It also help you to build your intellectual resources. So thinking back about how positive emotions would increase people's creativity in the moment, right? So over time, moments after moments of your creativity being enhanced, your cognition being enhanced by positive emotions would help us build our intellectual resources. And it's also help us build social bonds in the long term. Right? So people who experience positive emotions are more pro-social. They're more likely to socialize. They're more likely to be kind to other people. So that in the long term help people to build their social bonds, social network, and securing more social resources. And finally, physical health, right? So positive emotions can build physical health through various mechanisms. Positive emotions can buffer people from stress it can also motivate people to kind of like explore, go out and pursue better health behavior. So in that way, accumulations of a lot of positive emotions over time also lead us toward having better physical health. And these resources, in turn, also help us to experience positive emotion more easily, right? Let's say, for example, if you have more social resources, you have high quality connections and friendship with other people, it creates more opportunities for you to experience more positive emotions. And so it creates sort of an upward spiral, a term called by Dr. Bart Fredrickson of positive emotions. So so again, positive emotions help to build all these resources, and these resources help us to experience more positive emotions. So it's an upward spiral, and people flourish in this spiral. So, to experience positive emotions, it's not simply to just like, oh, I want to experience more positive emotions. Sometimes it takes sort of intentional steps to be able to increase your experiences of positive emotions. So these are a short list of things you can do that have been shown by research. No way this is exhaustive, but these are something that you can do. For example, savoring your experience. So this would include anticipating a positive experience. For example, when you have a vacation coming up, right? You can, sort of like anticipate it, plan it, think about it more, and that would increase your positive emotions. When you are on the vacations, you can try to be fully in the present moment, fully enjoy your experience of the vacations. And after you finish the vacations, you can look back on the photos, sort of like sharing that with other people, so reminiscing it. So this is one way to sort of like maximize the amount of positive emotions that you would get from an experience. You can also do act of kindness, be kind to people, do nice things for them, and this is actually shown to be a very effective way to make people feel more positive. You can count blessing. It's called, you can do like 3 good things. So every day you can just like list 3 good things that you're grateful for or that went well for you. You can imagine your best self, visualizing how like your full potential. Loving kindness meditation and mindfulness meditations has also been recently studied a lot, and it's shown that it helps to increase positive emotions and improve people's mental well-being. Another way is to prioritize positivity. So a simple way is to make plans to do activities that will give you joy. So that would help you feel joy and get more positive emotions. However, you should avoid what researchers call toxic positivity. So, which, kind of like colloquially, I would call positive vibes only. So it's defined as the assumptions, either by yourself or by other that, despite a person's emotional pain or difficult situation, they should only have positive mindset. They should try to be positive all the time. And this doesn't work, and it's actually backfire. It's make people feel more negative. It make people feel shame if they cannot experience positive emotions. So avoid this approach. Avoid saying that, oh, I should feel positive all the time. No, you don't have to, because thinking back on the affect as information theory, negative affect does give you some really useful informations that help you adjust to your environment, right? So it's very functional. It's not bad to feel negative emotions. So with that said, this is one of your essay options. Feel free to take a few seconds to read it. So this is your learning outcome number 5. All right, let's talk about cultural differences. Culture is an important force that shape our emotional experience and perceptions. And the studies I'm going to show you guys often compare individualistic versus collectivistic culture, and individualistic cultures are typically found in the US or European countries, whereas collectivistic cultures tend to be East Asian or Southeast Asian cultures, including countries such as Japan, China, or Philippines. So keep in mind that the differences we are discussing here are only on average. Right? So within the culture, there are a lot of variations in subgroups and in individuals. So, but on average, there's a detectable differences. So these findings should you should be cautious to sort of interpret these findings on the individual basis, because it doesn't necessarily apply to the individual. It applies to the group on average, right? Okay, so with that caution, let's talk about individualistic versus collectivistic culture. In individualistic culture, the individual is value, and the self is viewed as an independent entity from others, right? And so in this culture, this kind of culture, self-expressions and standing out, is value. In contrast, in collectivistic culture, the group is value. The self is viewed as interdependent. So the self is viewed as part of the group, as connected to other people. So in collectivistic culture, standing out and individual self-expression is more often discouraged, and social harmony and blending in, how to be, how to get along well with other people, those are the things that are valued in collectivistic culture. So this cultural differences in how people view the self, and how people, what goals are important for the cultures, lead to differences in the experiences of emotions. So in a study by Kitayama and colleague in 2006, the researchers measured the prevalences of emotions across culture to see what kind of emotions are experienced more in one culture versus the others. And so they find that North American culture, people in North America tend to experience more socially disengaging emotions, such as pride or anger, right? So these emotions are socially disengaging because it set you apart, right? So pride sort of, experience when you feel proud of yourself, when you feel like you're doing something exceptional and better than others. Anger, the same thing, you're exerting yourself, you're exerting some sort of power, and it's also sort of pushed other away. So these emotions tend to be experienced more in North American compared to Japanese. In contrast, in Japanese culture, because the goal of the cultural goal is to maintain social harmony, right? To keep everyone getting along well with each other. People experience more socially engaging emotions, such as friendliness and guilt. So friendliness friendliness feeling like compassion or just being kind, seems help people bond and get along well with each other. Guilt also serve as a way to motivate people to reconcile, to repair broken social bond, or to to help people reconcile after something bad has happened between the two parties. In additionally, because in collectivistic cultures, people have to try to get along well with other people, right? They apparently develop more attentions to emotional inflections or vocal tones in what other people say, so so that they can understand what other people's feelings. And in the study by Ishii and colleague in 2003, the researcher found that people in Japanese and Filipinos show more attention to vocal tones and emotional inflections of what is said compared to American, versus American would pay more attention to the literal meaning of the words. And this again served as a way for people in collectivistic culture to better understand the emotions of other people, so that they can adjust to the social situation better and help to maintain social harmony. So you might wonder, well, what if I have two cultures? I'm sure some of the people in this class live in two different culture environment. And what researcher has typically find is that when you switch your cultural environment, your behavior and the emotion you experience tend to also change and is affected by the cultural context. Right? So I have a friend who live both in Japan and the U.S., and she spoke to both Japanese and English, and she and her friends noticed that she become a lot more agreeable when she speak Japanese, and she become more sassy when she speak English. So that's a really funny thing. All right, let's talk about gender differences in emotions. The biggest difference in gender differences in emotions tend to be about emotional expression. So women are more likely to express emotions. They're more accurate in perceiving other people's emotions. And they show more facial expressivity, but not self-reported emotional experience in react to an emotional event. Right? And so this is pretty interesting because we tend to assume that women are also more emotional beings, but apparently the differences in emotional experience is not that certain between men and women. The more certain differences, the differences that we are more confident about is actually the how much men versus women expressing emotions. So we shouldn't assume that both the genders have difference in their emotional experiences. Also, this research has typically been done in cis men and cis women, so that's kind of limited because it definitely has not covered other group of genders. So hopefully in the future, those limitations will be addressed. But right now, this is what we have. So why do you guys think that these gender differences emerge? So there's probably a combination of nature versus nurture, and what we observe here is a lot of these differences seems to reflect gender role, and and it seems to be consistent with gender role. So women are typically expected to display a greater levels of most emotions, right? In today's society, particularly positive emotions such as happiness, and some negative emotions, some negative emotions that are sort of more internalizing, such as sadness, fear, anxiety, shame, and guilt. Women's also expected to display more empathy and sympathy than men, right? Um, so this norm for emotional expression is consistent with the role and stereotype of women having to be more relationally oriented, nurturing, and accommodating than men. In contrast to the display rule for women's emotions, men, at least in Western culture, are expected to show less of the tender emotions such as sadness or anxiety. However, men are allowed to express externalizing emotions such as anger, contempt, or disgust. So those are okay to express a lot. So this is consistent with societal gender roles for men to be assertive, individualistic, independent, and even aggressive, right? And that reflect the traditional role for men to be like the protector and income earner or breadwinner for the family, etc. So you can see that these gender roles possibly would have shaped how men and women express their emotions differently. So finally, let's talk about the emotions of stress. Certainly, this is very prevalent emotions. It seems to be on the rise, and it's something that you college students are probably all familiar with. So why do we experience stress? Stress is actually an evolutionary adaptation that is beneficial because it gives us early alarm to potential threat in the environment. And it also helps to rally our physiological response to attend to and to deal with the stress using the sympathetic nervous system to activate our body, to activate the fight or flight reactions, right? So it's very useful for our survival in the past. Performance has been shown to be linked to stress. And it has an interesting relationship. It has a curvilinear relationship. So lower stress actually linked to lower performance. And then performance would improve as stress increase up to a point, up to like a sweet spot. And after that tipping point, the more stress we have, the lower performance we would have. So up to a point, stress become too overwhelming and it interfere with performance. So to illustrate this, you can think about sport, playing the sport. Right? If we experience no stress and anxiety at all and are too relaxed, we probably are not sort of like pumped enough to play sport effectively. Just about the right amount of pressure and stress would help your body get activated, get your mind really focused, right? And then that improve your performance. But too much stress, and then the players might start choking and play worse. So we all probably familiar with how the familiar with the negative side of stress. We might be talking about like the clinical level of stress, for example, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The stress reaction, extreme stress reaction, happens after a dramatic event. And this is more like in the realm of clinical psychology rather than social psychology. And these stress reactions has very detrimental effect on health and longevity. For example, research found that survivors of Hurricane Katrina had a rate of heart attacks that was 3 times higher than the national average in the years following the disaster. So that's, it's kind of an illustration of how impactful stress, clinical level of stress is on people's health. However, even if it's not clinical, persistent, invasive daily stress also have consequences on health, right? So stress, daily stress that happen for a very, very long time, also predict really, negative long-term health outcomes. So these daily hassle that you experience, might seem small one day to another, but accumulated over a long time, it's also predict negative health outcome. For example, there's an interesting statistic of the day of the week that people are more likely to experience a heart attack. And so the day of the week, what day would you guess? So if you think it's Monday, that's correct. People have a highest chance to have a heart attack on Monday, probably because we start working and just the amount of stress certainly spike up. So there's many reasons why stress would would deteriorate health. One reason is the stress sort of under stress response, our body release cortisol, and long-term, elevated level of cortisols would damage our health. For example, it would create more plaque in blood vessel and damage blood vessel, leading to long-term cardiovascular disease risk, for example. And one of the reasons for stress, for like this daily hassle, is the lack of goal progress. Right? So the research on goals and the discrepancy between our current self and our ought or ideal self influence, sort of generate stress or depressions. So Higgins, Tori Higgins sort of defined the two different kind of goal. The ideal goals is the goals that we want to achieve. The ideal self is the person we want to become, right? Versus the ought goal, or the ought self. The ought goal are the goals that we feel responsible for doing. It is our duty, right? The ought self is the person we kind of responsible for becoming, or for the person that other people expect us to become. So when we fall short of our ideal self, or when we fail to achieve our ideal goal, the emotional responses tend to be sad or depressed. And when we're not fulfilling our ought goals or our responsibility, or when we're not becoming, the person that other people expect us to become, we tend to experience emotions like anxiety or stress. So falling short of our responsibility and our duties, and the expectations that people have for us tend to induce stress and anxiety. For example, let's say, well, you might not be that excited about doing homework for this class, but that's what you have to do. So when you feel like you're not making enough goal progress toward completing the assignment that you're supposed to do, the emotions you probably would experience is stress and anxiety. So I include on this slide a TED talk on stress that's very informative and interesting to watch. So I encourage you to watch it to understand more about the effect of stress on the brain and on your health. Okay, well, finally, after scaring you enough with, all the stress is bad talk, how do we cope with stress? There's many ways to cope with stress. 2 ways. There are 3 ways that are, empirically validated and strongly support empirically. which is exercise. So aerobic exercise, any kind of exercise help, but aerobic exercise or high intensity interval trainings seems to be the most effective for managing stress or reducing stress. Meditations also have strong evidence backing it as a way to reduce stress. So there's also a link to a very interesting TED Talk on being mindful and mindfulness meditations that I included in here. Finally, there's a very counterintuitive way to cope with stress, which is to think that stress is good. And there's actually a research on stress mindsets, whether people think that stress is good or stress is bad. When people, so there's a couple of studies on this. So people with, they survey like national sample, and they measure people level of stress, whether they think that stress is good or stress is bad, and then they follow these people for years to see and measure their health outcomes. And what the researcher find is that people with high stress but think that stress is bad have lower longevity, so they die earlier compared to people who have little stress. However, people with high stress but think that stress is good, right? Their health outcomes are not different from those people who experience little stress. So thinking that stress is good is very powerful. So there are experiments showing changing our stress mindsets, actually changing how people respond to stress physiologically. So it changed the profile of physical activations in response to stress. By thinking that stress is good, people who's facing stress actually has a healthier physiological activation profile in response to stress. So for example, their heart would beat faster, would like pounding, but the blood vessel dilate. Right? So the response is more similar to being ready for playing sport. And that response is actually healthy. It's a healthy kind of stress. So I also encourage you guys to watch a TED Talk video on the adopting stress is good mindset. And this is very informative.